Welcome to Assembly Calendar. I'm Mike Friesen. With us for our program today, Assemblyman Brian Curran. Brian Curran represents the 14th Assembly District in New York State, an Assembly District that includes parts of Nassau County. We want to thank you folks all across Long Island for tuning in for our program today. Brian Curran, nice to see you.
Good to see you too, Mike.
Normally, we'd start off our first show of a legislative year talking about the startup of the year, the governor's State of the State address, his budget proposal to the legislature, and believe me, we will be getting to all those things in just a little bit. But we've got some housekeeping to take care of.
Yes, we do.
There was a little bit of a legislative session before the end of 2011 where the legislature was called back into session by the governor, and he wanted to make some changes before this new year got started, specifically to the tax code, the different tax brackets that exist right now in New York State, and some other things as well that I think are pretty important to the people you represent.
He did, and it lived up to its name. It was an extraordinary session of the legislature that was called up, especially in December. The governor had called for the session, and basically it was dual purpose. Everybody had previously heard about what was referred to as the millionaire's tax, and that was, first a tax that didn't deserve its name because it was a tax on families making $250,000 and more, which the Republican caucus of the Assembly had previously voted against earlier in the year, and we were going to continue to vote against it. But what the governor had done was crafted legislation that, and by the way, the millionaire's tax was set to expire December 31st of 2011. He had crafted legislation in which it would do three things. It would restructure the tax code, whereby middle-class families earning between $40,000 and $300,000 a year would receive a tax cut, and they would actually reduce the marginal rate of those middle-class income families to the lowest rate in 58 years, which we want. That's what I believe I was elected to do up here, is to actually help out middle-class families and reduce their rate as best as possible. The second and third parts of the legislation was just as important. And Mike, you know as well as I do, this state has been struggling for years, probably the last 20 years, with regards to its economy and being a pro-business type of state. And what this legislation did was two things, especially for Nassau and Suffolk County. It repealed the MTA payroll tax, which is an absolute job killer for Nassau County and Suffolk County. It repealed it by 80%. And then it also reduced the corporate franchise tax for every small business and manufacturing business throughout the state by 50%. That was the three main components of the legislation that was presented in December and voted upon by the Assembly. And I have to tell you, I proudly voted for it because it provided that immediate tax relief for middle-class families, and also was a pro-business legislation that will help the small businesses and manufacturers in Nassau County.
Let me show some images we have of you meeting with some of the groups in your area, some of the local business groups. There you are, obviously speaking before the Lindbergh Chamber of Commerce, and there's other groups that we'll identify as we go through these. What were what were the representatives of these groups saying to you, for example, about the MTA payroll tax?
You know what? They were saying the same exact thing that I've been hearing since the day that I decided to run for the Assembly a year and a half ago. And what they were saying is, that, particularly with regards to the MTA payroll tax, it was a job killer. It was preventing small businesses from hiring people because it was just another percentage of their income that was going to state government that they didn't have to give. And that's what we were actually hearing from all of the businesses. And as you see in some of the photographs, this was a tri-meeting between the chambers of Lynbrook, Malvern, and East Rockaway. And Mike, I'm glad that you actually put these pictures up, because the MTA payroll tax and the excessive tax burden on local businesses, that was the main topic at this meeting, and that's why I was happy to speak at it. And at this time, this meeting took place right before the session. I wish I could actually have brought them the good news, but I know that I've been in touch with all three of them since then, and they're ecstatic about the fact that the MTA payroll tax is just about a thing of history, which is good for not only all of New York State, but particularly with regards to the economy of Nassau County and the small businesses in there.
It was levied across the board, even not-for-profits, right?
Absolutely.
Had to pay that tax?
And schools, although the schools and the municipalities were in there. The schools were going to be reimbursed in the year following that they made payment. Although Some of the schools would suggest to you that they never receive full reimbursement, and they would have to budget for that. But the legislation that we voted on in December took all of the schools, private, parochial, elementary, public, all out of the MTA payroll tax, which all the schools were thankful for as well. So it's a good step in the right direction. We just have to get the other 20%, because one of the biggest people that were still included in the MTA payroll tax was the libraries. And we have to get the libraries out of the MTA payroll tax so they have a little bit of fiscal breathing room or flexibility with their budgets.
Now, you mentioned the corporate franchise tax. I don't know all that much about that. I don't own my own business, that sort of thing. So that could be one of those subjects that for me I would tend to glaze over on. But I'm smart enough to know that the people that we were just looking at in some of those photos, the people in the business communities that you represent, they know about the corporate franchise tax, and they know that that's something that's not good for their business.
Listen, any word that ends in tax is a good thing if you're eliminating it here in the state of New York, and particularly with regards to small businesses. The bottom line is, and you know it as well as I do, Mike, we've been killing small businesses, manufacturers, big businesses in this state for the last 25 years. And we see that in the mass exodus of jobs and businesses out of this state. We got to stop doing it. And thank God, at least for the last 13 months, we've been setting the course where we've been going in the right direction of cutting that burden on small businesses so we can help our economy. Because that's the only way that we're going to bring a state out of the deficit and the economic problems that we're experiencing.
And I think it's fair to say, and you tell me whether it is fair or not, to say that a large portion of the success of the direction that the state's going in right now is due to the new governor in the state, Andrew Cuomo. He came in a year ago and said he was going to do X, Y, Z. He was going to do a property tax cap for localities and municipalities. He was going to try to balance out those books, so to bring revenues in line, or expenditures rather, in line with what the revenues of the state were. And he seems determined to do that again his second year now in 2012.
Mike, let me tell you, fiscally wise, listen, I don't agree with everything that the governor did, but on the fiscal side of the ledger, I don't think that you could have found a better governor in the last 13 years for this state to bring us out of the horrible economic situation that we found ourselves in. I mean, $10 billion in the hole. He presents a budget which actually balances the book without raises taxes and which doesn't raise fees. He's done a fantastic job, and this is coming from a staunch Republican to a Democratic governor. I think he's done an excellent job, and I think that he's worked so well with Senator Dean Skelos in the Senate, and they've really formed a bond which actually has gotten the right agenda through and getting the state back on the right path.
I think that's a big part of it, is that he has been able to come in and figure out how to deal with or how to work with the legislature, something that the last few governors in the state haven't been able to do.
He's done a great job.
Let's advance now to this 2012 legislative year. It started off, as most legislative sessions do, with an address from the governor. What we're going to hear now are some of the things that were said that State of the State Address Day here at the state capitol. You'll hear a little bit from the governor. You'll hear a little bit from Brian Curran, too. Let's take a look at that, and we'll be back with more of today's edition of Assembly Calendar.
We have just started tackling the problems that this state needs tackled. This agenda that we laid out today is an ambitious agenda, more ambitious than anything this government has done in decades and decades and decades. We can build the largest convention center in the country. We can rebuild Buffalo. We can transform the Jacob Javits site. We can build a whole new energy highway system. We have that capacity. It's who we are. It's where we come from.
Well, I think Governor Cuomo today reflected on the successes of 2011, and moving forward to 2012, the discussion is going to center around jobs, 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 which I certainly agree with, but certainly some of the ideas that the governor floated today, the key question is, where's the money going to come from?
We just got done with hearing Governor Cuomo's State of the State for 2012. I think the governor did an excellent job. He highlighted all of the accomplishments that we did in the last legislative session, which was a great session. We accomplished a lot on behalf of the people of the state of New York, but it was a good first step. This year we have to continue that momentum forward Specifically, last year, one of the biggest accomplishments was the property tax cap for the people of Nassau County, along with all the rest of the state. But that was the first step. This year, we have to go with the second step, and that's mandate relief across the board for both our local municipalities and our school districts. We have to do that. That should be priority number one, to give the school districts and the municipalities the fiscal flexibility to deal with the tax cap. That's what our first job should be. Then, of course, as always, we have to deal with a budget that has right now an anticipated deficit of about $3 billion. We have to do that, and I was glad to hear from the governor, who said that we're going to try to cut that deficit without increasing taxes. That was a campaign promise of mine. That's very important to make sure that we do that. And then lastly, of course, we have to get this state economy back going again. Jobs, that's what we need in both in Nassau County and this state to get it back on the right path so that we can actually be the Empire State.
You really touched on one of the things there that has been interesting to see since last year, since the implementation of that property tax cap, and that has been watching the localities, the school districts, the counties, the towns, the villages, the cities in the state, all trying to figure out how to live within that 2% growth paradigm, something with which I noticed the state legislature didn't put upon itself. The state's budget doesn't have a 2% tax cap on it. Many of them tried, many of them have been successful, others have kind of done an end around, because there are ways around that 2% cap. But you talked about mandate relief, and now no matter which group of localities we're talking about, the school districts, the municipalities, the villages, the towns, they're all saying the same thing, that the state is limiting how much we can increase our spending year to year, but the state is not doing anything about how much the state asks us to do by way of cost. Right. And that's a real difficult part of this equation right now.
Right, absolutely, Mike. But let me just tell you, first and foremost, to your point about limiting state spending, you're absolutely right. I'm actually on a bill as a co-sponsor to limit state spending. I think that if we're going to impose a tax cap or a spending cap on local municipalities and school districts, it should be imposed on us. And I think that we should do that. I know there are several bills out there, but one is mine, along with, I believe, Leader Culp, who has a state spending cap, which I think we should definitely entertain, and I hope the Assembly does so in the upcoming session. With regards to the property tax cap, you know what? The property tax cap was a great piece of legislation that we passed last year. But as I had said at the beginning and while I was campaigning for it, it is the first step of a two-step dance. And the first step was passing the tax cap. The second part of that dance is actually providing those municipalities with the fiscal flexibility to deal with the tax cap. I think it's unrealistic for legislators up in Albany, as well as residents of that municipality, to expect school districts and municipalities to live within a 2% tax cap and then still allow bigger municipalities, Albany, Washington, to dictate to those local municipalities that you still have to continue to provide services that they mandate, but not provide money for them to actually provide those services. Listen, essentially what we've been doing up in Albany and Washington is telling our school districts and our municipalities, but particularly our school districts, you got to provide $150 hypothetical education, but we're only going to allow you to collect $100 for it. That's unrealistic. So we have to actually start bringing back, eliminating and reducing all of these repetitive mandates that we've put on municipalities for the last 20 years. That's job one, and we got to do it right away. And
we've only got about 15 seconds here, but that's going to include, it sounds this year, on the table, the negotiating table with the governor's office and the legislature, pension reform, Medicaid reform. These are big ticket items here at the state capitol.
And it's tough legislation, but it's got to get done. I mean, we didn't get to this point all in one day, but we have to fix it right away.
All right, we are out of time. If you folks watching want to know how to reach out to your representative, you get a hold of Brian Curran by reaching him at his office in Lynbrook, dial 561-8216, or send an email at the address you see right there at the bottom of the screen, curranb@assembly.state.ny.us. And as we thank Brian Curran for joining us, we thank you folks too. We'll hope to see you soon for our next edition of Assembly Calendar.